The storm arrived without ceremony, a white wall swallowing the pines and the narrow pass that marked the Alpha King's northern border. Wind skated over stone, turning every breath into a sharp decision. In the high country, sound died quickly, muffled by snow that fell like ash, and the world became a blank page no one could read. Patrol torches vanished in the haze. Scent trails snapped and dissolved. Even the wolves that guarded these ridges moved cautiously, heads low, as if the mountain itself had become a predator. Far below, the river groaned under ice, pretending it had stopped. She stumbled through drifts that reached her thighs, refusing to look back for long. Her cloak had torn on rock, and cold needles found the skin beneath. One boot dragged, half-laced, and each step sent pain up her leg like a warning bell. She had been running since the last dusk, since the wrong eyes had noticed her leaving the settlement and since the safest roads had suddenly become traps. She carried no weapons, only a sealed letter inside her bodice, damp with sweat and fear, heavier than any blade. If she stopped, the mountain would bury her in truth. In the blizzard, faces became memories, and memories became knives. She told herself she was not prey, not a mistake to be erased for someone else's convenience. The letter pressed against her ribs, its wax seal warm from her body, and she imagined the Alpha King's crest stamped into it, a promise she had never been allowed to claim aloud. Somewhere behind her, the wind shifted, and with it came the faintest hint of unfamiliar scent, not close enough to name, but close enough to hurry her pulse. She chose a ravine, hoping depth would hide her for one night. At the ridge above, 3 pack trackers fought the storm with more pride than sense. They held a rope between them, gloved hands burning, and tried to read the ground where it no longer existed. The youngest swore he had seen a shadow moving below the last outcropping. The oldest shook his head, eyes narrowed against the white, and reminded him that shadows lied in weather like this. Their leader listened, jaw tight, weighing duty against the growing risk of losing them all. A signal horn sounded from camp, distant and thin, calling them back before night sealed the pass. When they returned, snow-crusted on their lashes, the council met them under the longhouse eaves. The Alpha King's advisors demanded a report that could be stamped into record and repeated until it became law. The trackers offered what the storm allowed, a torn strip of fabric snagged on a branch and a set of footprints that ended mid-stride in a drift. The council seized on the silence after that ending, turning it into certainty. Declared lost, declared dead, it was for the pack to mourn a body they did not have them to admit the mountain had outwitted them. The Alpha King stood apart from the council's conclusion, his gaze fixed on the storm line beyond the palisade. He had ruled long enough to know when fear dressed itself as practicality. Yet this was more than politics. Beneath the clamor of voices, beneath the scent of wool and smoke, a rhythm tugged at him, steady and insistent, like a drumbeat carried through bone. He did not call it magic. He called it certainty. Somewhere out there, past the reach of reason and torchlight, something persisted. It was not an order he heard, but an invitation he could not refuse. The Beta tried to stop him, but tonight the Alpha's resolve held fast. Advisors warned of borders, rival packs, and the old law that a lost wolf became a lesson, not a crisis. He listened, then focused on the youngest tracker, whose shaking hands offered the torn fabric once more. Frost clung to it, yet beneath the cold lingered a trace of wildflower oil, wrong for winter and painfully familiar. The scent tightened his chest, not as grief, but as fury at how quickly absence became proof. He ended the meeting, let the search finish, and mapped path into storm. Down in the ravine, the snowfall thickened, sealing her footprints behind her like a closing door. She slid on loose scree, caught herself on a frozen root, and bit down a cry that the wind would have stolen anyway. Her hands were numb, but she forced them to work, dragging branches across a shallow hollow, shaping a crude shelter with stubborn care. The effort kept panic at bay. She pressed the letter to her lips, a private vow made to no one she trusted. Above the ravine, ice cracked, and she froze, listening for footsteps that never came, only wind. Night settled early, and the pack performed its ritual of acceptance, murmuring thanks to the mountain around a guarded fire. The Alpha King stayed only long enough to keep peace, then slipped away while the council's certainty still hovered in the smoke. In his quarters he spread a single map and traced one route, an old game trail that cut behind the ridge and dropped into the ravines. He chose supplies quickly, avoiding attendants whose questions would slow him. The pull inside his chest returned, steady and intimate, like a second heartbeat keeping time with his own, and demanded action. She curled inside her makeshift hollow, knees to chest, using her body to shield the letter from damp. The branches above her sagged as snow thickened, and the air tasted of pine sap and cold metal. She tried to measure time by her breathing, but the storm stole even that, forcing her thoughts inward. She pictured the Alpha King as she had last seen him, distant in a hall of judgment, and wondered if distance had been his choice or someone else's design. Her eyes fluttered. In the dark, beneath the roar, her heartbeat persisted, stubborn and clear still there. The Alpha King left the warmth of the longhouse behind as if it belonged to another life. Outside, the cold took him immediately, sliding under his collar and into his lungs, but it was not the weather that made him tense. Something deeper held him, a sensation that did not fit the logic of tracks and maps. It came like pressure behind the ribs, a steady insistence that refused to fade with distance. The blizzard had erased roads and certainty, yet this pull sharpened the farther he went, as though the storm had stripped away noise and left only the one signal he could not deny. At first, he tried to name it the way a ruler did: instinct, responsibility, a lingering doubt about an incomplete report. But the truth moved under those words and made him feel thin. His body reacted before his mind could argue. When he paused, his pulse did not settle, it synchronized with something else, an echo that seemed to travel through the wind and settle in his blood. He had felt it once before, long ago, during a quiet moment he had dismissed as exhaustion. Now it returned with purpose, demanding his attention like a hand closing around his heart. Back inside the settlement, the council did not sleep. Elders gathered in small clusters, their concern shaped less by compassion than by order. The Alpha's refusal to sign the final declaration of death became a problem they could measure. Warriors who had already burned grief into their faces began to resent the uncertainty, because uncertainty made them look weak beyond the borders. The Beta attempted to keep the Alpha's choices from becoming public fracture, but the tension leaked anyway. A king could bend tradition, but tradition had its own weight, and tonight it pressed down on every shoulder. When the Alpha returned briefly to collect what he needed, the elders met him at the threshold as though they could form a barrier with their bodies. They spoke with the patience reserved for rulers who strayed too close to myth. They reminded him of the mountain's toll, the rival territory beyond the pass, and the old law that no leader chased ghosts while his pack waited. He listened without lowering his gaze. Authority was not only the ability to command, it was the willingness to be alone in a decision others feared. The pull inside him tightened until it felt like breath held too long. Their objections forced an old memory to the surface, not gentle, but sharp. He remembered her the first time he noticed she existed as more than a name on a list. It had been years ago, at a midwinter tribunal, when she stood at the edge of the hall carrying a tray meant for someone else. Her hands were steady despite the crowd's scrutiny, and her eyes met his without pleading. She had looked like someone who did not expect mercy, someone who had learned to survive without it. In that brief exchange, something had shifted in him, as if the air itself recognized a missing piece returning. He had buried that moment under duty in politics. Her presence was inconvenient, her background tangled in alliances the council preferred to keep quiet. She was useful to the pack in ways no one praised, and dangerous in ways no one admitted. The Alpha had watched her from distance, noticing how she moved through corridors that were not meant for her, always careful, always listening. He never summoned her openly, never offered protection that would spark questions. Yet every time she disappeared from his view, he felt the same faint disturbance, like a compass needle twitching when a storm approached. Tonight that disturbance became a certainty. The sealed letter she carried, the one no one knew about, returned to him as a shadow of wax and ink. He could not explain how he knew she held something that mattered, only that the knowledge existed like a bruise. He saw again the torn fabric the tracker had offered, smelled that wrong for winter oil, and understood that the blizzard was not the first attempt to erase her. The storm was simply the most convenient cover. His jaw hardened. If someone had arranged the mountain to finish what politics began, then his hesitation had already cost too much. He moved through the armory without ceremony, selecting supplies meant for travel rather than war. A lantern, a coil of rope, a compact field kit, and a cloak heavy enough to fight the wind. He refused the escort the Beta quietly indicated he should take. Too many witnesses would turn his search into spectacle, and spectacle into argument. The elders watched him with a strained composure, measuring the consequences of disobedience. The Alpha did not threaten him, because threats would admit weakness. He simply acted, and in that action the settlement felt, for the first time in years, that their king was answering to something older than their rules. As he stepped beyond the palisade, the storm swallowed the last trace of firelight. The path into the pass was a narrow wound through trees bent by wind. His senses stretched, searching for what the trackers could not find. Scent was unreliable, drowned by cold and snow, but the pull inside him did not waver. It guided him when the ground became a guess. It tightened when he veered wrong, loosened when he corrected course, as if an invisible thread connected him to a moving point in the white. The rational part of him tried to protest, yet the protest sounded like cowardice. He reached the ridge where the tracker's trail had ended and stood still, letting the storm batter his face until his eyes watered. The world offered no landmarks, only shifting curtains of snow. He closed his eyes anyway, focusing inward, listening the way hunters listened to silence. Beneath his own pulse, another rhythm persisted, faint, stubborn, dangerously close to vanishing. It was not a voice, not a cry, not even a scent. It was pure life refusing to be extinguished. In that rhythm he felt her exhaustion like pressure in his lungs, her fear like cold in his hands, her will like a spark trapped under ice. The ridge dropped into a ravine the pack considered cursed, not because of spirits, but because rival borders tangled there in old, unresolved disputes. Tradition called it forbidden because forbidden was easier than complicated. The Alpha stared into the white void where the ravine opened and understood what his council feared. If he crossed, he would not only defy weather, he would defy politics that had kept fragile peace. He would become visible to enemies who waited for any sign of weakness. Yet the pull inside him surged, turning caution into something that felt like betrayal. He had ruled for stability, but stability built on silence was only another kind of storm. He descended anyway, using rope and careful footing, letting the mountain's cold bite through his gloves. Each step away from his territory made his choices heavier, yet the invisible thread grew stronger, more precise, as if rewarding his refusal to turn back. The blizzard raged above, but down in the ravine the wind shifted and carried a different air, pine sap, old stone, and something faintly human that made his spine tighten. His heart matched the distant rhythm more closely now, and for the first time he sensed direction with terrifying clarity. By the time he reached the ravine floor, the world had narrowed to one truth: she was not dead, and someone wanted everyone to believe she was. The Alpha lifted his lantern, scanning the drifted shadows for signs the storm tried to hide, and the heartbeat he followed swelled in his chest until it felt like it could pull him forward without his legs, growing stronger, and leading him away from his pack. She woke to the sound of nothing, which was worse than pain. Silence meant the storm had buried the world deep enough to smother even its own voice. For a moment she could not remember where she was, only that cold had replaced thought, seeping into her bones until her body felt like something abandoned rather than alive. When memory returned, it did so in fragments: the ravine, the fall, the frantic scraping of her hands against ice as she searched for shelter before darkness closed in completely. The structure had revealed itself by accident, a jagged line beneath snow where stone interrupted white. It was old, older than the pack's current borders, half collapsed and forgotten for reasons no one bothered to record. She had crawled inside with more instinct than intention, dragging her injured leg behind her and biting back the urge to rest. Rest, she knew, was a promise the cold made before it took everything else. Inside, the air was stale but mercifully still, a pocket of quiet carved into the mountain's cruelty. Now she lay curled against stone, her cloak stiff with ice, fingers numb beyond pain. One foot burned sharply, then dulled, a progression she recognized with dread. Frostbite was not dramatic, it was patient, like the mountain itself. She forced her hands to move, rubbing warmth into skin that no longer felt like it belonged to her. Each small motion cost her, draining energy she could not afford to lose, but stopping felt more dangerous than exhaustion. She took inventory the way she had been taught as a child, when fear threatened to scatter her thoughts. She was alive, she was alone, she had one working leg, one that protested with every shift of weight. Her supplies were gone, scattered when she fell, except for the letter pressed against her chest, still there, still dry enough to matter. The wax seal was cracked, but the parchment inside remained intact, stubborn as she was. She did not open it. Its words were meant for daylight and safety, not for this narrow space where hope felt fragile. Time lost its shape quickly. The cold erased the boundary between minutes and hours, turning them into a single, unbroken effort to keep breathing. She rationed movement, shifting only when numbness threatened to pull her under. Her thoughts drifted to the settlement she had left behind, to faces that would not look for her long. She had never belonged cleanly to any place, always useful, always peripheral. The idea that the storm might finish the work others had begun settled heavily in her chest, heavier even than fear. She refused that ending with quiet stubbornness. Forgetting was a kind of death she would not accept. She had carried messages no one else dared, had listened when silence was safer, had survived long enough to matter even if no one admitted it aloud. The mountain did not get to decide she was expendable. She pressed her palm flat against the stone floor and grounded herself in its cold reality, anchoring her mind to sensation so it would not drift into the soft dark that tempted her with rest. Outside, the storm changed tone, not weakening, but shifting, as if testing her attention. Snow slid down the ravine walls in small avalanches, whispering like breath too close to the ear. Each sound made her heart jump, then settle again when nothing followed. She counted those moments, telling herself that awareness meant she was still here. She whispered nothing, conserving breath, but her thoughts were loud, crowded with images she refused to surrender. She pictured warmth not as comfort, but as work still to be done. Her injured leg throbbed with a steady insistence that bordered on accusation. She examined it with clumsy care, fingers shaking as she traced swelling beneath fabric. The pain sharpened when she moved it, a warning she acknowledged and ignored in equal measure. If the storm eased even slightly, she would have to move, to find a way up or out before the cold finished what injury began. The structure was shelter, not salvation. It bought time, nothing more. Nature seemed to respond to her defiance with renewed pressure. Wind found a weakness in the collapsed wall and pushed Snow inside, dusting her cloak and face. The cold intensified, as if the mountain resented her refusal to yield. She pulled her knees closer, tucking her chin down, and focused on breathing evenly despite the ache in her lungs. Every inhale tasted of stone and ice. Every exhale felt like loss. Still, she breathed, because breathing was an act of resistance. Memories surfaced uninvited, sharp and inconvenient. She remembered the Alpha King's hall, the distance he kept, the weight of words never spoken. She remembered the look he had given her once, fleeting and unreadable, and how she had dismissed it as imagination. She had learned not to expect rescue, not from people, not from fate. Survival had always been solitary, a series of small choices made in the absence of witnesses. If anyone came for her now, it would be accident, not intention. She accepted that without bitterness, because bitterness wasted energy she needed. Her fingers finally began to tremble uncontrollably, a sign she could not ignore. She forced herself to move again, scraping snow aside to reinforce the weak point in the wall with loose stone. The effort blurred her vision, stars flashing behind her eyes, but the draft eased slightly. She leaned back, breath ragged, and closed her eyes for what she promised herself would be only a moment. Darkness pressed in immediately, soft and persuasive, offering relief from effort. She fought it by pressing the letter against her skin, feeling the edge of parchment, the faint indentation of ink through wax. It reminded her that she was more than this moment, that her life intersected with something larger than the ravine and the storm. The mountain could test her, strip her of comfort and certainty, but it did not get to decide her worth. That decision had already been made by the simple fact that her heart still beat, steady and unwilling to stop. The storm outside faltered, just enough to change the quality of sound. Snow still fell, but heavier, clumsier, as if the mountain itself was growing tired. In the pause between gusts, she heard something else, so faint she thought it imagined at first. A disturbance in the silence, irregular and deliberate. Her breath caught. She strained to listen, fear and hope tangling painfully in her chest. The sound came again, clearer this time, unmistakably not the wind. Footsteps echoed outside, slow and careful, approaching the shelter as her strength finally failed her. The Alpha King moved deeper into the ravine with the stubborn precision of someone who had already decided there was no turning back. The storm no longer roared here. Instead, it pressed close, heavy and watchful, as if the mountain were holding its breath. Each step demanded attention. Ice glazed the rocks beneath the snow, and one mistake would mean a fall no authority could command away. His muscles burned from the cold and the climb, but he welcomed the pain. It kept him sharp, kept him anchored to the purpose driving him forward. He tracked what no one else could have named. There were no clean footprints, no obvious signs left behind, only disruptions so subtle they would have meant nothing to another set of eyes. A branch bent at the wrong angle. Snow packed more densely in one hollow than the wind alone would manage. These were not clues taught by mentors or written into law, they were answers his body recognized without permission. The pull inside his chest guided him when logic failed, tightening when he strayed, easing when he corrected course, until following it felt less like choice and more like obedience to something ancient. As he descended farther, the land itself changed character. The ravine narrowed, its walls steep and scarred, marked by old boundaries that had never fully healed. This was rival territory, claimed and contested through generations of uneasy truces. Every step he took here carried consequence beyond the immediate danger. If he was seen, if word reached the wrong ears, his presence could be read as provocation. An alpha crossing borders alone did not look like mercy or concern, it looked like weakness or threat, depending on who told the story. He felt the weight of his crown more keenly with each breath. Back in the settlement, elders would already be counting the hours of his absence, measuring risk, imagining outcomes. Some would argue his authority weakened by impulse, others that it revealed recklessness they had long suspected. The beta would be forced to mediate tensions, to explain a silence that grew louder with every passing moment. The alpha knew this, carried it with him, and still did not slow. Leadership demanded sacrifice, and tonight the sacrifice was his own certainty of standing untouched by consequence. Emotion crept in where discipline thinned. He thought of the council chamber, of the careful distance he maintained from those who might be used against him. He had believed that restraint protected both the pack and himself. Now that belief felt brittle. If restraint led to abandonment, then it was not wisdom but fear wearing a noble face. The realization unsettled him more than the cold. He had ruled by law and balance for years, but balance meant nothing if it required closing his eyes to truth. The pull surged suddenly, sharp enough to make him stop. He braced himself against the ravine wall, breath fogging the air as dizziness washed through him. His body protested the pace he had forced on it, muscles trembling with exhaustion he had ignored for too long. For a moment, the world tilted, and he wondered if the mountain would take him too, quietly and without witness. He pressed his palm to stone, grounding himself, listening past the rush of blood in his ears. In that stillness, the connection clarified. It was not only direction he sensed, but condition, fading strength. A will stretched thin. The knowledge struck him with unexpected intimacy, as if her struggle echoed through his own limbs. His jaw clenched, anger cutting through fatigue. Whatever had driven her here, whatever danger still hunted her, had underestimated her resilience and his resolve. He would not allow the mountain, or politics, or tradition to finish what they had started. He pushed on, though each step now felt heavier than the last. His breath came in harsh pulls, lungs aching with cold air. Snow found its way into his boots, numbing his feet until sensation dulled and returned in painful waves. The alpha did not curse the weakness, he acknowledged it and kept moving. Power was not the absence of limits, but the decision to confront them honestly. Tonight, power meant continuing when stopping would be easier. The ravine widened slightly, opening into a pocket where the storm's debris had settled unevenly. The pull inside him intensified, nearly overwhelming, dragging his focus toward a cluster of half-buried stone. He slowed, scanning the area with care now, instincts sharpened by urgency. This place felt wrong in the way traps did, not dangerous by design, but forgotten, neglected by time until it became hazardous by accident. Snow-covered gaps that could swallow a body whole. Ice-hid edges meant to break bone. He noticed the structure then, or rather the absence around it. Snow piled differently here, disturbed not long ago. A collapsed wall revealed dark stone beneath, sheltered from the worst of the wind. His heart hammered, no longer only from exertion. This was where the trail ended, where logic insisted death should have claimed its due. Every report, every declaration, every law said she could not be alive here. The mountain itself seemed to insist the same. Emotion threatened to fracture his control. He forced himself to approach carefully, not rushing the final steps. Hope could be as dangerous as despair if it made him careless. He circled the site, reading it the way he read a battlefield, noting the dragged marks half hidden by fresh snow, the faint disturbance where someone had crawled rather than walked. These signs were small, easily dismissed, but together they formed a narrative no storm could fully erase. His chest tightened as realization settled in. This was the place where she should have died. Where the mountain, the storm, and the pack's certainty all converged into a single conclusion that now lay broken at his feet. The pull inside him roared, undeniable, no longer distant or abstract but immediate and fierce. He lifted his lantern, light spilling across stone and shadow, and stepped closer to the shelter, knowing that whatever he found next would change more than the fate of one woman. The lantern's light fell into the shelter like a cautious hand, revealing stone slick with frost and branches pressed into place with desperate intelligence. The Alpha King did not call out. Sound carried strangely in the ravine, and he did not know who else might be listening. He let silence guide him, scanning the uneven floor, the collapsed wall, the narrow pocket of darkness where someone could hide or die unnoticed. The pull inside his chest tightened so sharply it felt like a warning. Then he saw her. She was folded against the far wall, half wrapped in a cloak that had stiffened into a rough shell. Snow dusted her hair and lashes as if the storm had tried to claim her gently after failing to do so violently. Her face was pale in the lantern glow, lips tinged with the faint blue that made every instinct in him flare. For a terrible second she looked like what the pack had already declared her to be, a body waiting for permission to be mourned. He forced himself closer, controlled and careful, as though his composure could keep her alive. He knelt beside her, ignoring the bite of cold seeping through his knees. His gloved fingers hovered near her throat, reluctant to confirm what he feared. When he finally touched her skin, the cold shocked him, but beneath it he felt a pulse, faint and uneven, as if her heart was arguing with the mountain over whether it had the right to keep beating. Relief hit him hard enough to steal his breath. It was not triumphant. It was raw, almost painful, because it came paired with the knowledge of how close he had been to arriving too late. His jaw clenched until it ached. He had survived wars and negotiations that would have broken lesser rulers, yet this small, fragile proof of life cracked something inside him with frightening ease. The storm had nearly taken her, and the pack's certainty had nearly helped it. He assessed her quickly, the way he would assess a wounded warrior, but his hands betrayed him with an extra gentleness he could not summon for anyone else. Her fingertips were stiff, skin pale and waxy. Frostbite threatened in the swollen joints. Her breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible, a thin thread that could snap if pulled the wrong way. Her injured leg lay at an unnatural angle beneath her cloak, and the sight sparked anger that tasted like iron. The shelter was no longer enough. Staying here meant watching her fade, and he would not do that. Moving her meant risking what little strength her body still held. Mercy, he realized, was not softness. Mercy was decision under pressure, the kind that did not allow perfect outcomes. He had to choose a path that might save her, knowing it might also be the one that broke her. He pulled off his outer cloak and wrapped it around her, layering warmth over the brittle cold clinging to her skin. His hands worked quickly but deliberately, avoiding sudden movements that might jolt her into a shock she could not survive. He checked her pulse again, then her breathing, then the color in her lips, searching for any sign she was slipping away. Her eyelids fluttered once, a movement so small it could have been imagined, but it struck him like a plea. He shifted closer and slid one arm beneath her shoulders, the other under her knees. Her body felt startlingly light, as if the storm had carved pieces away. When he lifted her, her head tipped toward his chest, and he felt her breath against him, faint but real. His heart thudded hard, as though it wanted to lend her its own strength. He had held injured wolves before, carried them off battlefields, but this was different. This felt like holding a truth he had denied for too long. As he turned to leave, the ravine's air bit at her exposed face, and her breathing faltered. He adjusted his grip, angling her closer, shielding her with his body. The lantern swung from his wrist, casting long shadows that made the walls look like they were closing in. Every step toward the ravine's opening felt like walking a tightrope above a fall he could not afford. If she stopped breathing, if her heart gave up, there would be no second chance, no council decree to undo it. His mind raced through options. He could retreat to the settlement, but the path was long and dangerous, and returning would invite questions he could not answer without exposing everything. He could seek shelter deeper in rival territory, but doing so would place her life at the mercy of outsiders who might see her as leverage. The storm had already proven that nature did not care about political borders, and neither did death. He chose the only option his instincts allowed: move fast, move smart, and trust the pull that had led him here. He followed the ravine's curve where the wind was weakest, keeping her close enough that her faint warmth pressed through his clothing. He listened for any shift in her breathing, any tremor in her pulse. Each time he felt her heart stumble, his own tightened in response, as if their bodies had agreed to share one rhythm. The controlled exterior he wore like armor began to fracture. He remembered the moment in the hall years ago, when her eyes had met his with a steadiness that dared him to see her. He remembered all the times he had chosen silence because it was safer. In the harsh quiet of the ravine, safety felt like a lie he told himself to avoid consequence. He had let her exist on the edges of his world, and now the mountain had nearly erased her for it. Something inside him shifted from responsibility into something more intimate and dangerous. It was not possession, not the crude claim of dominance. It was recognition. His instincts did not treat her as a stranger he had rescued, they treated her as something already his to protect, as if the bond had been waiting beneath the surface all along, patient and unspoken. He did not need ceremony to name it. He felt it in the way his body adjusted to keep her steady, in the way his focus narrowed to the fragile rise and fall of her chest. She stirred again, a faint tension in her fingers against his cloak. Her lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but no sound came. The effort cost her. Her breath hitched, then stuttered, and he stopped immediately, lowering his face close to hers, willing warmth into her with nothing but proximity and stubbornness. He could not command her body to hold on, could not bargain with the mountain. All he could do was refuse to let her go quietly. Her heartbeat, once a steady pull that guided him, began to falter against his chest, uneven and frighteningly slow. His grip tightened instinctively, not to hurt her, but to keep her anchored to the world. The lantern light trembled over her face, and for a heartbeat he saw not the survivor, not the secret messenger, but someone impossibly close to being lost. Her heart faltered again in his arms. The Alpha King did not return through the main gates. He came in through the old service passage carved into the hillside, a route meant for hauling supplies in harsh winters when the front road iced over. The guards posted there straightened in surprise, then hesitated, caught between protocol and the unmistakable authority in his posture. He did not explain. He did not slow. He carried her as if the weight of her life was the only law that mattered, his cloak wrapped tight around her, her face hidden from the wind and from questions. Inside, warmth hit like a shock. The air smelled of smoke, pine resin, and the faint metallic tang of winter blood. He moved toward the healer's quarters without pausing, ignoring the whispers that started the moment anyone recognized him. The beater appeared in the corridor, eyes widening at the sight of the bundled figure in the Alpha's arms. The Alpha spoke only one command, low and final, and the beater stepped aside, already understanding that this was not a matter for debate, not tonight. The healer's room was narrow but clean, lit by oil lamps and lined with shelves of dried herbs and bandages. The healer, an older woman with steady hands and sharper eyes, took one look at the girl's color and began issuing instructions before the Alpha had even set her down. Blankets were pulled free, hot stones wrapped in cloth, water warmed on the stove. The Alpha stood too close, not interfering, but refusing to leave. His gaze tracked every motion, every adjustment of cloth and skin, as if proximity could keep her anchored to breath. They laid her on the cot and peeled away layers stiff with ice. Her skin beneath was mottled from cold, lips cracked, fingertips swollen and pale. The healer clicked her tongue, not unkindly, and began working with practiced urgency, rubbing warmth into her hands, checking her pulse, listening for the thin thread of breath. The Alpha watched the rise of her chest like it was the only measure of time left in the world. Each shallow inhale looked too small. Each exhale sounded like surrender delayed by stubbornness. When she shivered, the healer nodded once, grim satisfaction flickering across her face. Shivering meant the body still fought. It meant she had not drifted completely into the quiet dark that claimed so many in storms like this. The Alpha let himself breathe again, but only slightly, because relief still felt dangerous. He had seen wolves die on beds warmer than this when their spirits chose to leave. He knew that the line between survival and loss was not drawn by medicine alone. Hours blurred into one long vigil. The Alpha sat at the edge of the cot after the healer finished her first round of treatment, his forearms resting on his thighs, hands clasped tight enough to ache. He listened to the crackle of the fire and the soft rustle of the healer moving through her supplies. Outside the room, the settlement stirred with rumor. By dawn, every ear would know that the Alpha had returned with someone who should have been a corpse beneath the ravine snow. The backlash arrived before daylight, carried in controlled footsteps and careful voices. Elders requested the Alpha's presence in the council hall, phrasing it as concern, as procedure. The beater delivered the message quietly, eyes uneasy. The Alpha did not move. He gave a short answer that sounded like refusal without needing the word. The beater hesitated, then nodded, understanding that the Alpha's absence from the hall was itself a statement. Let them wait, let them wonder. He would not leave her breathing unattended to satisfy pride. Still, the cost of his choice pressed in. He could feel it through the walls, through the sudden tension in the guards' movements, the way servants paused too long outside the healer's door. The pack was accustomed to rules that made their world predictable. This was not predictable. The Alpha King had crossed borders. He had brought back a woman the trackers declared dead, and he now sat beside her as if she mattered more than council decrees. Some would interpret that as weakness. Others would see something worse, a shift in power that threatened the old order. While politics gathered teeth, she drifted in and out of awareness like a ship caught between shore and deep water. Sometimes her lashes fluttered, sometimes her fingers curled weakly around the blanket. The healer spoke softly to her, not with sentiment but with grounded insistence, coaxing her body to remain. The Alpha watched those small movements with a focus that made everything else blur. When her breathing steadied for an hour, his shoulders loosened. When it faltered, he leaned forward as if his presence could pull her back. In her half-conscious state, memories rose without structure, leaking through her in fragments that revealed more than she meant to show. She muttered names under her breath, broken syllables that carried fear. Once she gasped and tried to sit up, eyes wide and unfocused, as though she had seen something behind the healer's shelves. The Alpha caught her gently, easing her back down, his voice low, not demanding answers, only offering steadiness. She calmed after a moment, but the tremor stayed in her hands. The healer noticed, as healers did. She began to ask careful questions when the girl's eyes opened briefly, questions not about the storm but about what came before it. The answers were not coherent, but the emotion was. Betrayal, cornered decisions, a warning whispered too late. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes without falling, as if her body did not have the strength to waste on grief. The Alpha's jaw tightened each time, anger sharpening into something dangerous. Whoever had pushed her into the blizzard had not only endangered her body, they had carved fear into her mind. As days passed, the pack's perception began to shift. At first, she was a problem, an unknown that upset the record of what was supposed to be true. Then she became a curiosity, whispered about in corridors. How had she survived? Why had the Alpha gone alone? What did it mean that he sat at her bedside each night, refusing to let anyone else take that watch? Wolves who had never spoken her name began to wonder if they had misjudged her worth. Wolves who had benefited from her invisibility began to grow uneasy, sensing that her survival might illuminate things better left hidden. The Alpha kept guards outside the healer's quarters, not as a display but as protection. He did not trust the sudden interest blooming around her. Too many eyes now measured her as either threat or tool. The healer complained once that soldiers made patients restless. The Alpha adjusted, stationing them farther down the hall. He did not argue. He simply ensured no one approached unseen. Power, he reminded himself, was not only authority over others. It was the willingness to stand between danger and the fragile thing you refused to lose. On the fourth night, her fever broke. The healer's hands, usually brisk, slowed as she checked the girl's pulse and nodded with quiet approval. Color returned faintly to her cheeks. The frostbite remained a threat, the injured leg a problem that would take time and pain to heal, but she was no longer slipping away. She lingered closer to waking now, hovering at the edge of consciousness as if deciding whether the world she would return to was worth the effort. The Alpha did not leave when the healer finally insisted he should sleep. He sat in the dim light, listening to her breathing, memorizing its steadiness like a prayer. In those quiet hours, his thoughts returned again and again to the unspoken bond he could no longer deny. It had guided him through the storm. It had led him to her heartbeat beneath the ice. Now it held him here, keeping him anchored beside her as if moving away would break something essential. Just before dawn, she stirred with more intention than she had before. Her eyes opened, unfocused at first, then sharpening slightly as they adjusted to the room's low light. She blinked slowly, confusion threading through her expression. Her gaze drifted across the ceiling beams, the herb shelves, the shadowed corner where the Alpha sat. When her eyes finally landed on him, he leaned forward without thinking, relief rising like breath after drowning. She stared at him for a long, silent moment, her brow knitting with effort as if searching for a name that would not come. The Alpha held still, not wanting to startle her, not wanting to push. He waited for recognition, for any sign that she understood who had carried her out of the storm. Instead, her eyes widened with alarm. Her hand moved weakly toward her chest as if to protect something unseen, and her breath caught. She whispered a hoarse, uncertain question, not his name, not even close. The sound of it struck him harder than any council accusation. She had awakened, and she did not recognize him. Her first full day awake did not look like triumph. It looked like confusion stretched thin over exhaustion, like a mind fighting to assemble itself while the body still trembled from cold and injury. The healer kept her wrapped in layers, feeding her broth in careful spoonfuls, watching her eyes more closely than her pulse. The Alpha remained near, but not too near, keeping his presence steady without forcing it into her space. She looked at him often, as if he were a riddle she could almost solve, and each time her gaze slid away, frustration and fear tightened the corners of her mouth. She remembered things in pieces. Not names, not sequences, only sensations that made her flinch, hands grabbing her arm too hard, a corridor lit by a single torch, the sharp scent of someone's cologne that did not belong in the winter air. When the healer touched her frostbitten fingers, she jerked as if expecting pain from something else entirely. Her eyes darted to the door whenever footsteps passed in the hall. The Alpha watched these reactions and felt anger settle deeper, heavy and controlled. Her body had survived the mountain, but her mind still expected betrayal. The letter remained hidden beneath her pillow, kept there by her instinct even while memory failed. The healer discovered it when changing linens and tried to move it aside. The girl reacted with startling speed, grabbing the parchment with a weak but desperate grip. Her lips formed a word she did not finish. The healer backed away, hands raised in calm surrender, and the Alpha saw something important in that panic. Whatever was inside that letter was not just information. It was the reason she had been hunted into the blizzard. By the second evening, the council's patience broke into open insistence. Elders arrived at the healer's quarters under the pretense of concern, their voices soft but edged. They wanted to confirm she lived. They wanted to see her face, to measure her for vulnerability. The Alpha stood between them and the cot without raising his voice, and that refusal carried more weight than any shouted order. He allowed only the senior elder inside, and even then, only for moments. The elder's gaze moved over the girl like assessment, not empathy. He asked gentle questions that were too precise. Where had she been before the storm? Who had last seen her? What had she carried? The girl stared blankly, caught between confusion and the sense that answering incorrectly could end her. The healer interrupted, stating firmly that the patient needed rest. The elder nodded, smiled thinly, and left with the kind of calm that made the Alpha's instincts bristle. As the door closed, the Alpha felt the truth settle into place with hard clarity. The pack had accepted her death too quickly because it solved something. Her absence erased a complication. It protected someone who did not want her speaking. The storm had been convenient, but the intention behind it was human. He began his own quiet investigation that night, moving like a ruler who understood that accusations without proof were invitations to rebellion. He summoned the trackers who had led the search, questioning them separately. Their stories aligned until they reached the moment the trail ended, then each hesitated on a detail that did not fit, the faint scent of oil that did not belong, the suggestion of a second set of boot marks partially covered, the way the search had been redirected with sudden urgency from a messenger who claimed to speak for the council. The messenger's name surfaced quickly, a junior guard assigned to the elder's household, known for obedience and ambition. The Alpha summoned him next, not to the council hall but to a private chamber where shadows softened the edges of power. The guard arrived pale, eyes flicking toward the Alpha's hands as if expecting punishment. The Alpha asked simple questions. Who gave you the order? Why did you carry it into the storm? The guard stammered, insisting it was procedure. The Alpha waited in silence until the guard's fear grew too loud to sustain the lie. He broke under pressure that was mostly the weight of the Alpha's gaze. The order had come from an elder, delivered as urgency for the pack's safety. The search was too dangerous, the guard had been told. Too costly. The girl was already gone. Yet in the guard's voice, another truth slipped through. The elder had been relieved. Not sorrowful, relieved. Her first full day awake did not look like triumph. It looked like confusion stretched thin over exhaustion, like a mind fighting to assemble itself while the body still trembled from cold and injury. The healer kept her wrapped in layers, feeding her broth in careful spoonfuls, watching her eyes more closely than her pulse. The Alpha remained near, but not too near, keeping his presence steady without forcing it into her space. She looked at him often, as if he were a riddle she could almost solve, and each time her gaze slid away, frustration and fear tightened the corners of her mouth. She remembered things in pieces. Not names, not sequences, only sensations that made her flinch, hands grabbing her arm too hard, a corridor lit by a single torch, the sharp scent of someone's cologne that did not belong in the winter air. When the healer touched her frostbitten fingers, she jerked as if expecting pain from something else entirely. Her eyes darted to the door whenever footsteps passed in the hall. The Alpha watched these reactions and felt anger settle deeper, heavy and controlled. Her body had survived the mountain, but her mind still expected betrayal. The letter remained hidden beneath her pillow, kept there by her instinct even while memory failed. The healer discovered it when changing linens and tried to move it aside. The girl reacted with startling speed, grabbing the parchment with a weak but desperate grip. Her lips formed a word she did not finish. The healer backed away, hands raised in calm surrender, and the Alpha saw something important in that panic. Whatever was inside that letter was not just information. It was the reason she had been hunted into the blizzard. By the second evening, the council's patience broke into open insistence. Elders arrived at the healer's quarters under the pretense of concern, their voices soft but edged. They wanted to confirm she lived. They wanted to see her face, to measure her for vulnerability. The Alpha stood between them and the cot without raising his voice, and that refusal carried more weight than any shouted order. He allowed only the senior elder inside, and even then, only for moments. The elder's gaze moved over the girl like assessment, not empathy. He asked gentle questions that were too precise. Where had she been before the storm? Who had last seen her? What had she carried? The girl stared blankly, caught between confusion and the sense that answering incorrectly could end her. The healer interrupted, stating firmly that the patient needed rest. The elder nodded, smiled thinly, and left with the kind of calm that made the Alpha's instincts bristle. As the door closed, the Alpha felt the truth settle into place with hard clarity. The pack had accepted her death too quickly because it solved something. Her absence erased a complication. It protected someone who did not want her speaking. The storm had been convenient, but the intention behind it was human. He began his own quiet investigation that night, moving like a ruler who understood that accusations without proof were invitations to rebellion. He summoned the trackers who had led the search, questioning them separately. Their stories aligned until they reached the moment the trail ended, then each hesitated on a detail that did not fit, the faint scent of oil that did not belong, the suggestion of a second set of boot marks partially covered, the way the search had been redirected with sudden urgency from a messenger who claimed to speak for the council. The messenger's name surfaced quickly. A junior guard assigned to the elder's household, known for obedience and ambition. The Alpha summoned him next, not to the council hall but to a private chamber where shadows softened the edges of power. The guard arrived pale, eyes flicking toward the Alpha's hands as if expecting punishment. The Alpha asked simple questions. Who gave you the order? Why did you carry it into the storm? The guard stammered, insisting it was procedure. The Alpha waited in silence until the guard's fear grew too loud to sustain the lie. He broke under pressure that was mostly the weight of the Alpha's gaze. The order had come from an elder, delivered as urgency for the pack's safety. The search was too dangerous, the guard had been told. Too costly. The girl was already gone. Yet in the guard's voice, another truth slipped through. The elder had been relieved. Not sorrowful, relieved. When the Alpha finished reading, the silence stretched heavy between them. He felt the old order pressing at his back, urging caution, urging delay. He also felt the weight of her gaze, steady and unyielding. She was not asking him to save her anymore. She was asking him to stand with her. The choice reshaped him. He began to change how he ruled in ways that could not be easily undone. He summoned elders not as a block, but individually, confronting inconsistencies, demanding clarity where there had been comfortable vagueness. He elevated voices that had been ignored, including those who had worked alongside her and benefited from her quiet competence without ever acknowledging it. He did not accuse openly yet. He gathered truth like kindling, preparing for a fire that would need to be controlled or it would consume everything. Her presence beside him during these shifts did not go unnoticed. She stood when he stood, sat when he sat, silent but unmistakably aligned. Some interpreted it as influence, others as threat. Both were correct. She did not seek power, but power responded to her survival as if recognizing a force it had underestimated. Emotionally, she changed too. The fear that once tightened her movements loosened its grip. She slept without waking at every sound. She laughed once, softly, surprised by the sound as if it belonged to someone else. The Alpha noticed these moments and stored them carefully, aware that they were victories as real as any political gain. Their conversations grew less guarded, shaped by mutual respect rather than caution alone. The bond between them no longer needed silence to exist. But strength, once visible, attracts challenge. Whispers grew sharper. A council meeting was called without the Alpha's request, framed as urgency. A rival clan sent envoys with smiles too polished to trust. The elder whose household had moved in shadows grew bolder, sensing that time was no longer on his side. Pieces shifted into place with the inevitability of a storm building pressure behind clouds. She sensed it before the first move was made. Survival had taught her to read tension the way others read weather. The air inside the settlement felt charged, conversations clipped, guards repositioned just slightly wrong. She warned the Alpha quietly, not with panic, but with certainty. He believed her without question. That night, as she prepared to return to the healer's quarters, a bell rang from the outer watchtower, sharp and deliberate. Not an alarm of attack, but a signal of internal breach. The Alpha was already moving before the sound finished echoing, authority snapping into place like drawn steel. She stood as well, heart steady, fear replaced by resolve. Somewhere within the pack's walls, the enemy made their move. The bell's echo had barely faded when the settlement fractured into motion. Guards converged on the inner corridors, not with the measured calm of an external threat, but with the brittle urgency of something gone wrong inside the walls. The Alpha King moved at the center of it, his authority snapping into place with instinctive precision. Orders flowed from him without hesitation, each one calculated to contain chaos rather than ignite it. Still, beneath the control, he felt the truth press hard against his ribs. This was not a test of strength alone. It was a test of allegiance. The breach was not violent in the obvious sense. No blades clashed, no blood spilled. Instead, it revealed itself through disobedience. 2 guards assigned to the eastern passage failed to respond. A sealed door stood open where it should not have been. In the council wing, voices rose in argument, elders demanding explanation while offering none. The Alpha understood immediately. This was an internal strike, designed to force him into a corner where any move would cost him something vital. He reached the council hall as elders gathered in defiant clusters, their faces set with a mix of indignation and calculation. At the center stood the elder whose household had moved in shadows, flanked by supporters who spoke too loudly about tradition and order. They accused the Alpha of secrecy, of endangering the pack by harboring a woman who destabilized established law. They framed their challenge as concern for unity, their words polished and rehearsed. The Alpha listened without interrupting. Silence, here, was not retreat, it was restraint sharpened into focus. When he finally spoke, his voice cut cleanly through the noise. He did not argue their claims point by point. He named the truth instead. There had been an attempt to erase a life for convenience, to bury evidence under a storm, to protect power by sacrificing one who could not easily defend herself. The hall fell quiet, not because they believed him, but because he had said aloud what many feared was possible. The risk was immediate and visible. Wolves shifted uneasily. Some looked to the elder for reassurance. Others glanced toward the Alpha, searching for certainty. Loyalty, he knew, was not a fixed resource. It was something that had to be earned again when tested. By standing publicly with her, he challenged not only one elder, but the entire framework that had allowed silence to masquerade as stability. She entered the hall without announcement. The room reacted before anyone spoke. Conversations faltered. Bodies turned. The woman who should have died in the blizzard walked into the center of power on her own feet, leaning lightly on her staff, her presence steady and unyielding. She did not stand behind the Alpha. She stood beside him, an alignment that required no explanation. The murmurs that followed were not cruel. They were unsettled. Seeing her alive stripped the argument of abstraction. This was no longer about law in theory. It was about a person the pack had abandoned. When she spoke, her voice carried without force. She did not accuse. She did not plead. She told her story as it existed, not dramatized, not softened. She spoke of the letter she had carried, of overheard conversations and instructions disguised as concern. She described the moment she realized she was being guided toward isolation rather than safety. She spoke of running not from the storm, but from people who had decided she was expendable. Each word landed with weight because it was measured, chosen, and free of desperation. Her calm unsettled them more than anger would have. The elder attempted to interrupt, invoking tradition, claiming her memories were compromised by injury and fear. She turned to him then, meeting his gaze with a steadiness born of survival. She did not challenge his authority. She challenged his certainty. She named details only someone present could know. A phrase he had used. A signal sent too early. A messenger he assumed invisible. The elder's composure cracked, just slightly, but enough. In leadership, cracks mattered. The Alpha felt the moment tilt. This was the line he could not uncross. He stepped forward, placing himself fully between her and the council's judgment. He declared her testimony valid. He declared the investigation ongoing. And most dangerously, he declared that any attempt to silence her would be treated as an act against his rule. The hall erupted, not in violence, but in division. Some elders rose in protest. Others sat frozen, realizing the implications. Standing with her publicly cost him immediately. 2 elders withdrew their support, citing loss of confidence. A senior guard asked to be relieved of duty, unable to reconcile loyalty with disagreement. The Alpha accepted both without argument. Leadership was not about clinging to numbers. It was about defining the ground on which allegiance stood. If he compromised now, the pack would fracture slowly anyway, poisoned by fear and half-truths. She watched him absorb the fallout without flinching, and something inside her settled. For the first time since the storm, she did not feel like a secret being protected. She felt like a truth being acknowledged. When the Alpha paused, giving her space, she stepped forward again, this time not as witness, but as participant. She asked the council a single question: if survival outside the law proved its failure, what was the law meant to protect? No one answered immediately. The question lingered, uncomfortable and unavoidable. The reckoning spread outward from the hall. Wolves gathered in clusters, debating in low voices. Some clung to tradition as anchor, fearing that change would unravel everything they relied on. Others felt a cautious hope, recognizing that the old system had never truly served them. The pack was not unified, but it was awake, and that awareness could not be reversed. The Alpha met with the Beta in the hours that followed, adjusting defenses not against external attack, but against sabotage. He ordered records opened, alliances reviewed, and messengers reassigned. These were not dramatic gestures. They were structural shifts that signaled permanence. He was no longer managing crisis. He was redefining leadership. She remained visible throughout it all, refusing the safety of retreat. When wolves approached her with questions, she answered what she could and admitted what she could not. Her honesty disarmed suspicion more effectively than secrecy ever had. Strength, she understood now, was not the absence of vulnerability, but the refusal to let vulnerability be weaponized. By nightfall, the elder who had initiated the challenge found himself isolated. Allies distanced themselves quietly. Servants avoided his gaze. He had underestimated the Alpha's willingness to sacrifice comfort for truth, and he had underestimated her capacity to endure scrutiny without breaking. Still, desperation bred boldness. As the settlement quieted into uneasy rest, messages moved through back corridors, plans accelerating under the pressure of time running out. The Alpha stood on the balcony overlooking the grounds, the cold air sharp in his lungs. She joined him without speaking, the space between them filled with understanding rather than words. Below, the pack shifted and murmured, a living body adjusting to pain and possibility. He knew the final confrontation was inevitable now. Truth, once named, demanded resolution. Somewhere in the dark, an enemy prepared their last attempt to seize control. The pieces were in motion. The balance had tipped too far to be corrected quietly. The final confrontation began. The final confrontation did not end with spectacle. There was no single moment where victory rang clean and undeniable. Instead, it unfolded like the slow breaking of ice, sharp sounds echoing through the pack as fractures spread where pressure had been hidden for too long. Accusations were answered with records. Denials collapsed under names, dates, and witnesses who finally spoke because silence no longer felt safer than truth. Justice moved carefully, because reckless justice would have become another lie. The elder who had orchestrated her erasure was brought before the council at dawn, not dragged, not humiliated, but stripped of the authority that had protected him. The evidence was undeniable now. The letter, corroborated by uncovered transactions and intercepted messages, revealed a pattern of control disguised as stability. He had not acted alone, but he had acted decisively, believing the pack too fearful of upheaval to challenge him. He was wrong. Punishment came not as execution, but as exile and exposure. His name was removed from the lineage records he had manipulated. His alliances were dissolved publicly, ensuring no quiet return. Those who had followed him out of fear were given a choice, accountability or departure. Some stayed and faced consequence. Others left before the sun fully rose. The pack watched it all, understanding that justice was not clean, but it was necessary. The cost was not small. The Alpha lost elders he had once trusted. Old alliances fractured beyond repair. Some wolves chose distance over adaptation, leaving the territory their families had guarded for generations. Leadership reshaped itself through loss, and the Alpha carried that weight without regret, though not without grief. He understood now that ruling without change would have destroyed the pack more completely than any external enemy ever could. Through it all, she remained present. Not as symbol, not as shield, as herself. She stood when decisions were made, listened when voices trembled, and spoke only when her words added clarity rather than fire. The pack began to see her not as the woman who survived the blizzard, but as someone who had endured something far colder, deliberate abandonment. Her strength did not come from dominance, but from refusal to disappear. That refusal reshaped how wolves spoke of survival, of worth, of belonging. The Alpha watched the pack adjust with a clarity he had not possessed before the storm. Love, he realized, was not the distraction he had been warned against. It was focus. It stripped away excuses and demanded alignment between belief and action. Loving her had not weakened his rule. It had exposed the weaknesses that already existed and forced him to address them honestly. Their bond was no longer unspoken. It did not arrive as declaration or ceremony. It arrived in choice. He chose to consult her when reshaping the council structure, valuing her insight into the blind spots that had nearly killed her. She chose to stay, even when leaving would have been easier, even when the scars of betrayal still ached. Together, they chose transparency over control, accountability over comfort. The pack noticed. Wolves who had never expected to be heard began to speak. Wolves who had benefited from silence learned to adapt or step aside. Love became visible not in intimacy alone, but in governance. The Alpha no longer ruled from distance. He walked the grounds, listened openly, allowed disagreement without interpreting it as threat. She worked beside him, not as consort defined by proximity, but as partner defined by shared purpose. Their connection, forged in the ravine and tested in the hall, became a stabilizing force rather than a point of contention. Where fear once dictated policy, trust began to take its place. Still, the storm left marks. Her leg healed slowly, pain lingering like memory. His nights were not always restful, dreams pulling him back into white silence and the terror of almost arriving too late. They did not pretend survival erased consequence. They honored it by refusing to waste what it had given them: clarity, resolve, and the understanding that life was not promised, but chosen repeatedly. When winter began to loosen its grip, the Alpha led the pack back toward the northern pass. Not as conquest, as acknowledgement. They stood together at the ravine's edge, the snow receding to reveal stone and shadow where death had waited patiently. The structure still crouched there, half buried, unchanged by how much had changed because of it. The wind moved differently now, less hostile, more open. The pack gathered behind them, silent, watching as the Alpha and the woman stepped forward. This place, once cursed by certainty, became something else. A marker. The Alpha spoke of what had been lost there, and what had been reclaimed. He did not romanticize survival. He named the failure that had nearly cost a life and the choice that had prevented it. He declared that no law would ever again excuse convenience over truth. The pack listened, not because he commanded them to, but because they had seen the cost of ignoring such vows. She stepped forward last. She did not speak of fear. She spoke of refusal, of choosing breath when the world expected surrender, of how survival did not make her special, but responsibility did. Responsibility to remember, responsibility to stand when silence was easier. Her voice carried across the ravine, steady and unafraid, and the mountain did not swallow it this time. When they turned back toward the settlement, the future no longer felt like something waiting to happen to them. It felt like something they were building. Love did not soften leadership. It grounded it. The Alpha took her hand openly, not as declaration of ownership, but of alignment. The pack did not avert their eyes. Some smiled, some simply nodded. What mattered was that no one questioned it. The bond between them had already proven its strength in storm and shadow. It no longer needed defense. As they walked away from the ravine, snow melting beneath their steps, the place where death had waited lost its claim. Their future began there, not in the safety of walls or the comfort of tradition, but at the edge of survival, where a heartbeat had been followed home, and love chose to lead. The blizzard that was meant to erase her became the beginning of everything that followed. What survived the storm was not just a woman, but a truth strong enough to change a kingdom. The Alpha learned that real power was not dominance, but the courage to choose love over fear. Together, they turned loss into leadership and silence into strength. And where death once waited, a future finally took root. If this story pulled you in, pass it along to someone who loves powerful, cinematic storytelling like this. Stories like these only keep coming when a strong audience stands behind them and stays connected. Make sure you're part of what's next, because the next chapter is already on its way. Now here's a question for you. Where are you watching this story from today? Drop your country in the comments, and keep supporting the stories that deserve to be shared.